Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at a figure who sparks really intense, often opposite reactions. Saddam Hussein.
Definitely. For many, he's the image of a brutal dictator. Simple as that.
But the source we're digging into today offers a strikingly different lens.
Absolutely. This deep dive focuses just on one source. It's titled A Tyrant to the West, a Patriot to His People. And it presents a very particular and, frankly, quite challenging viewpoint on Saddam Hussein's life, his death.
Yeah, especially that really intricate relationship with the United States.
Exactly.
So our mission is pretty simple. Just unpack only what this source says. It goes beyond that standard narrative,
Yeah.
digs into the U.S.'s alleged role in both his rise and fall.
And the motives it claims were behind his execution and why, from this source's perspective, his legacy deserves maybe a more nuanced look.
Maybe even, as the title sort of suggests, a heroic understanding from a certain viewpoint.
We're going to walk through the source's arguments, basically point by point. We'll explore its claims about U.S. actions, the reasons it gives for the shifts in policy.
The alleged gains from intervention, and, how it chooses to portray Saddam himself.
And just to be clear, we're just here presenting its view, impartially, helping you understand the claims it makes and maybe why it makes them.
Yeah, think of us as your guides through this specific text. Let's open up this source together and see what fascinating and maybe uncomfortable insights it holds for you.
Okay. So this source kicks off by immediately tackling the U.S.-Iraq relationship. And it starts with a claim that might surprise a lot of people.
Which is?
That the U.S. did not initially see Saddam Hussein as an enemy.
Right out of the gate, it challenges that expected story. The source focuses really heavily on the 1980s, doesn't it? Detailing U.S. support during the Iran-Iraq War. Yeah. That was 80 to 88.
Right, and the source says the support was mainly because of a fear of Islamic fundamentalism, especially after the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
And it gets specific about intelligence help during that war.
It does. This source asserts that U.S. agencies like the CIA were providing satellite imagery, military intelligence, basically helping Saddam's forces target Iranian troops.
And it claims there are declassified documents confirming this.
That's what the source states, yes. It claims confirmation exists in declassified materials.
Wow. Okay, that detail alone is quite a point from the source. It also brings up his use of chemical weapons.
It does. And this perspective states the U.S. knew he was using them against Iranians and also his own Kurdish population, but continued the support anyway.
And a key piece of evidence it offers for that is
the U.S. removing Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism back in 1982. The source claims this was done specifically to make arms trading with Iraq possible.
Right, to enable that trade.
And to sort of symbolize this period of backing, the source points to Donald Rumsfeld's visit to Baghdad, meeting of the Saddam in 1983.
It frames that visit as a clear sign of America's strategic interest in supporting him then.
Exactly. That's how the source presents it.
So according to this source, the reason for this early support was purely strategic, viewing Saddam as a kind of bulwark against Iran.
And a partner in securing oil interests in the region, yes.
And the source really emphasizes that this support lasted until things changed globally, right? After the Cold War ended.
Precisely. That's the timeline it lays out. So this initial partnership, as the source presents it, it really is a detail that might stand out to you, especially considering what came later.
Okay, so moving on from that period of, let's call it strategic support, this source identifies a major turning point with the Gulf War.
Yes. It sees Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 as the absolute pivot, the event that completely shifted the U.S. attitude.
And it adds that provocative little suggestion, claiming the invasion was, quote, likely encouraged by vague diplomatic responses from the U.S.
Implying maybe a lack of a clear don't do it signal. That's the implication.
Whatever the cause, the response it describes was definitely swift. The source details the U.S.-led coalition, Operation Desert Storm in '91, going in to liberate Kuwait.
But here's a really crucial point the source highlights about the end of that war. It claims the U.S. deliberately chose not to remove Saddam from power then.
Intentionally stopped short. And this decision, the source argues, had big consequences.
Huge. It argues it let the U.S. establish a large, permanent military footprint in the Persian Gulf.
And, critically, it also gave the justification for imposing those severe sanctions on Iraq, which this source contends just devastated the civilian population for more than a decade.
Yeah, the source is very direct about why it thinks the U.S. attitude shifted after Kuwait. It argues it wasn't suddenly about human rights. No, it claims it was because Iraq under Saddam had just gotten too independent, too assertive, unwilling to just, toe the line with American geopolitical aims.
So this period, as the source frames it, that's the clear switch from uneasy ally to, well, strategic adversary.
That's exactly how it's presented. Open opposition from that point on.
Okay, which then leads the source directly into its view on the 2003 invasion.
Yeah.
And it frames this very starkly. The section heading is literally lies and greed.
Yeah, it doesn't mince words. Its strongest claim here is that the invasion was launched based on fabricated claims, specifically about weapons of mass destruction, WMDs.
And the source is quick to point out, no WMDs were ever found. It argues the intelligence used was later shown to be, well, exaggerated or just plain false.
Correct. It makes that point very forcefully.
And it points fingers directly at specific U.S. officials. It lists George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz.
As the key players pushing this agenda, which, the source says, was sold to the public as being about American security and promoting democracy.
Right. And it makes a particularly heavy accusation against Colin Powell, doesn't it?
It does. It states that he presented false evidence at the United Nations, specifically to try and build that international case for war.
So if WMDs weren't the real reason, according to this source, what were the true motives, the far more cynical reasons it talks about?
Well, the source spells them out pretty clearly. First, control of oil, and make sure to note Iraq had the world's 5th largest proven reserves.
Okay, oil. What else?
Second, it alleges profits for the military-industrial complex. It specifically names companies like Halliburton and Blackwater.
Claiming they had deep ties to U.S. officials and made billions from contracts during the occupation.
That's the claim. And third, strategic dominance. The source argues the goal was removing Saddam to destabilize a strong, secular Arab state.
Making it easier for the U.S. to exert long-term influence across the whole region.
Precisely. This source really doesn't pull any punches here. It makes very direct, very strong claims about what it sees as the true drivers behind the 2003 invasion.
Okay. Building on that then, the source looks at what it thinks America actually gained from the invasion and the occupation that followed.
Yeah, and it argues the U.S. didn't really achieve victory in the normal sense, stability, democracy. But it did achieve certain specific strategic goals it wanted.
What were those goals from this source's perspective?
It lists 4 main ones. First, neutralizing an independent Arab power. The source portrays Saddam as this leader who just refused to be a puppet state.
So his removal made Iraq easier to manipulate, it claims.
That's the argument. Second, establishing a permanent military presence. The source argues the invasion basically allowed the U.S. to build and keep long-term bases in a really critical region.
Makes sense from that perspective. Third,
facilitating corporate profits. Those lucrative reconstruction contracts, oil deals, flowing mostly into Western hands, it claims.
okay. And the fourth one?
Fourth, disrupting regional unity. The source claims taking out a secular nationalist like Saddam ultimately fractured Iraq along sectarian lines.
Creating chaos.
Creating chaos, yes,
Right.
which it argues divided potential collective resistance to Western influence right across the Middle East. The source suggests that chaos wasn't necessarily a failure of the plan, but maybe a calculated outcome tied to those motives it mentioned earlier.
Right, linking back to the lies and greed idea.
Exactly.
Now, this next section of the source, this presents a view of Saddam Hussein himself that's likely to be, well, the most challenging for many listeners, the most counter-narrative.
I agree. The source introduces this alternative perspective, portraying Saddam not just as a dictator, but as a kind of fallen hero of Arab resistance, defined by his defiance of Western imperialism.
Now, the source doesn't ignore that he ruled with an iron fist, right? It acknowledges the authoritarian nature of his regime.
It does acknowledge that, but it highlights specific points to back up this alternative view. It claims he brought a certain degree of unity to a very diverse nation, different ethnic, religious groups.
And it emphasizes his secular stance.
Yes, very much so. His opposition to colonialism, his strong resistance to religious extremism, which the source implies, is a contrast to the forces that came after his fall.
And it makes some specific claims about life under his rule.
It does. It states that women had significant rights, access to education, and that Iraq, under him, had one of the best healthcare and education systems in the Arab world at the time.
The source also argues he was a strong supporter of the Palestinians and opposed Zionist expansion.
Yes, and it claims this stance significantly angered Israel and its allies. Furthermore, according to this source, he deliberately kept foreign corporations out of Iraq's resources and refused to implement economic structural adjustments from bodies like the IMF.
Okay. And a really critical point this source stresses.
Is its assertion that Saddam Hussein never attacked American civilians, nor did he export terrorism to the West. It argues he actually maintained order in a region often plagued by internal conflicts, tribal, religious.
Right. And finally, how does the source interpret his execution?
Very specifically, it argues the fact that it was televised globally wasn't about justice. It was meant as a clear warning.
A warning, too.
To any other leader anywhere who might dare to defy U.S. global power, U.S. hegemony. This part of the source really forces you, the listener, to see Saddam through a very different lens than the conventional one, based only on these specific points it chooses to highlight.
Okay, so the source brings all these arguments together in its conclusion, which it titles, again, provocatively, The Manufactured Villain.
Yes, it summarizes its core idea. History is often written by the victors, and Saddam Hussein's public image has, according to the source, been deliberately shaped, manipulated to serve geopolitical agendas.
It repeats its argument. Okay, he had flaws, yes, but his defiance of the West, his efforts to modernize Iraq, his refusal to bow down, these things position him, in this source's view, not just as a villain,
But as a significant figure, maybe even a kind of fallen hero of Arab resistance. That's the framing.
and the source's final take on his death is just as strong.
It is. It states it wasn't a victory for democracy or justice. It calls it a calculated assassination designed to secure and protect imperial interests.
The source also points to what it sees as the negative, destabilizing consequences of his removal, right?
Definitely. It claims his fall directly unleashed sectarian warfare inside Iraq, and it argues it indirectly paved the way for the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. And the source wraps it all up with a really powerful, very direct statement. Saddam Hussein didn't hurt the American people. He only stood up to the American government, and for that, he paid the ultimate price.
So it concludes by framing his fate as a direct result of his opposition to the U.S. government, specifically, rather than anything he did against the American people themselves.
That's the final assertion.
So that's the journey this particular source takes us on. We've explored its claims from early U.S. support through that strategic shift it identifies, the invasion it calls, fabricated and driven by cynical motives,
To its alternative portrayal of Saddam Hussein himself and the negative outcomes it directly links to his removal.
and we've really focused just on presenting this specific perspective and the arguments laid out within this source material. We haven't brought in outside info or offered our own takes.
No, just walk you through what this source explicitly states.
And engaging with sources like this, even when they sharply challenge, the narratives we usually hear, it's really valuable, isn't it?
I think so. It helps you see how different perspectives get constructed. It provides a fuller, maybe more controversial picture of complex events.
And sharpens your ability to think critically about the information you encounter every day.
Absolutely. This source puts forward a very specific chain of cause and effect, doesn't it? Arguing Saddam's resistance to the U.S. government led straight to his death and then contributed significantly to the chaos that followed, including the rise of groups like ISIS.
So, based only on this source's perspective, what does that prompt you to think about? Maybe about the potential unintended or intended, according to this source, costs of geopolitical interventions.
Or how history ends up evaluating leaders who challenge the dominant global powers.
Yeah. What questions does this source's framing raise for you about the difference between, or who gets to define, tyrant versus patriot? Think about those ideas, keeping in mind, of course, this is just one distinct viewpoint among many.